What happens when a 17-year-old millionaire's son walks into court laughing about the elderly veteran he left bleeding on the side of the road? This teenager strolled into Providence Municipal Court like he owned the place, smirking at the victim's family, checking his designer watch while the charges were being read. But when Judge Caprio discovered what this young man had posted on social media just hours after the accident, what happened next became the most watched courtroom moment of the entire year. Before we show you exactly what Judge Caprio did that left this arrogant teenager in tears, less than 8% of you watching are actually subscribed. If you believe in justice and accountability, hit that subscribe button right now. This story is going to spread everywhere, and you don't want to miss what happens when privilege meets real consequences. It's a cold Tuesday morning in Providence Municipal Court, and Judge Frank Caprio is reviewing the case files before the day's proceedings begin. At 76 years old, Judge Caprio has spent more than 3 decades on the bench, presiding over thousands of cases involving traffic violations, petty crimes, and civil disputes. But something about today's docket makes him pause. The case of State versus Brandon Mitchell Worthington III has already generated significant media attention, and Judge Caprio has specifically requested that cameras be present to document these proceedings. The courtroom is packed this morning. Local news crews have set up their equipment in the designated press area. Dozens of community members fill the gallery, many of them wearing Veterans of Foreign Wars patches and Purple Heart pins. In the front row sits 72-year-old Harold Chen, a decorated Vietnam War veteran, his left arm still in a cast, his face bearing the faded bruises and cuts from an accident that nearly cost him his life. Beside him, his daughter Sarah grips his good hand, her eyes fixed on the empty defendant's table. There's an energy in the air, a palpable sense that something significant is about to happen. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, the bailiff calls the court to order. The case of State versus Brandon Mitchell Worthington III, 17 years old, charged with felony hit and run causing serious bodily injury, reckless endangerment, and leaving the scene of an accident. Brandon Worthington enters the courtroom like he's walking onto a yacht club patio. The teenager is wearing a custom, tailored navy blazer that probably costs more than most people's monthly rent, crisp white shirt open at the collar, designer jeans, and Italian leather loafers that gleam under the courtroom lights. His sandy blonde hair is perfectly styled, and there's a smugness in his posture that suggests he views this entire proceeding as nothing more than an inconvenience. And as he catches sight of Harold Chen in the front row, Brandon's lips curl into what can only be described as a dismissive smirk. He walks to the defendant's table with the casual confidence of someone who's never faced real consequences, flanked by 2 high-priced attorneys in expensive suits. His father, Brandon Mitchell Worthington Jr., a prominent real estate developer, sits in the second row, arms crossed, his expression suggesting annoyance rather than concern. Brandon casually checks his phone before one of his attorneys whispers something, and he reluctantly puts it away. Judge Caprio looks up from the documents in front of him, slowly removes his reading glasses, and studies the young man before him. The judge has already reviewed the police reports, the hospital records documenting Harold Chen's injuries, and perhaps most disturbingly, the social media posts that were captured before Brandon's attorneys could scrub them from the internet. Mr. Worthington, Judge Caprio began, his voice measured and calm. You stand accused of striking Harold Chen with your vehicle on the evening of October 15th, causing him serious bodily harm, and then fleeing the scene without rendering aid or notifying authorities. How do you plead? Brandon glanced at his lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Richard Pemberton, who nodded slightly. Not guilty, Your Honor, Brandon said, his tone carrying none of the respect the moment demanded. There was almost a boredom in his voice, as if he were ordering coffee rather than answering to felony charges. Judge Caprio's eyes narrowed slightly, but he maintained his composure. Mr. Worthington, do you understand the severity of the charges against you? We're not talking about a parking ticket. Mr. Chen suffered 3 broken ribs, a fractured arm, a severe concussion, and internal bleeding. He spent 8 days in the intensive care unit. Do you comprehend what that means? Brandon shrugged in front of the judge. Your Honor. Attorney Pemberton interjected quickly. My client is a minor from a respected family. He has no prior criminal record. We believe this is all a misunderstanding that can be resolved through appropriate channels. A misunderstanding. Judge Caprio repeated, his voice taking on an edge. Mr. Pemberton, I've been on this bench for over 30 years. I've heard many things, but I'm curious how you characterize leaving a 72-year-old man bleeding on the side of Franklin Street as a misunderstanding. Before the attorney could respond, Judge Caprio turned his attention to the prosecution. Mems Rodriguez, please present the state's case. Assistant District Attorney Maria Rodriguez stood, a thick folder in her hands. Your Honor, on the evening of October 15th at approximately 7:45 p.m., Harold Chen was crossing Franklin Street in a marked crosswalk when he was struck by a 2024 Mercedes G-Wagon traveling at an estimated 45 miles per hour in a 25 mile per hour zone. The impact threw Mr. Chen approximately 15 feet. Instead of stopping, the driver accelerated and fled the scene. 3 witnesses immediately called 911 and provided a description of the vehicle and a partial license plate. She continued, traffic cameras captured the incident and clearly showed the defendant's vehicle striking Mr. Chen. The vehicle was registered to Brandon Mitchell Worthington Jr., and when police arrived at the Worthington residence later that evening, they found the defendant's Mercedes in the garage with significant front end damage, including a shattered headlight, cracked windshield, and damage consistent with striking a pedestrian. And did Mr. Worthington voluntarily speak with police? Judge Caprio asked. Only through his attorneys, Your Honor. He refused to provide a statement. However, we have obtained other evidence that speaks to the defendant's state of mind and character. Maria Rodriguez pulled out several printed screenshots. Your Honor, approximately 3 hours after the accident, while Mr. Chen was undergoing emergency surgery, the defendant posted several messages on social media. The entire courtroom fell silent. Even Brandon's smirk faded slightly. What did these posts say, Ms. Rodriguez? Judge Caprio asked. Those tones suggested he already knew the answer. Your Honor, at 10:37 p.m., the defendant posted a photo of himself at a restaurant with the caption, and I quote, "Rough night lol, needed a vibe check with the squad. Nothing a little daddy's money can't fix." At 11:15 p.m., he posted another message saying, "People really need to watch where they're walking. Not my problem if they can't move fast enough." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Harold Chen's daughter Sarah stood up, her face flushed with rage, before the bailiff gently guided her back to her seat. Judge Caprio held up his hand for silence. Brandon's attorneys immediately went into damage control mode. Your Honor, these posts were taken out of context. My client is a teenager who made an error in judgment with social media. Nothing more. An error in judgment. Judge Caprio's voice was ice. Mr. Pemberton, I want to be very clear about something. This court is not concerned with protecting the reputation of wealthy families or preserving the comfortable lives of privileged young people who think the rules don't apply to them. This court is concerned with justice. He turned his attention to Brandon directly. Young man, I want you to look at Mr. Chen. Go ahead, turn around and look at him. Brandon reluctantly turned, barely glancing at the elderly veteran before turning back around. No, Judge Caprio said firmly. Really look at him. Take a good long look. This time Brandon turned more fully, his eyes meeting Harold's for the first time. The veteran sat there dignified despite his injuries, his purple heart pin catching the light. Mr. Chen, Judge Caprio said gently, would you like to address the court? Harold Chen slowly stood, his daughter helping him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. Your Honor, I served 2 tours in Vietnam. I saw friends die. I came home with shrapnel still in my leg and nightmares that lasted decades. But I never felt as helpless, as worthless, as I did lying on that street, bleeding, watching taillights disappear into the darkness. His voice cracked slightly. I'm 72 years old. I walk to the grocery store every Tuesday to buy food for the week. I was in that crosswalk. I had the light. And this young man hit me and drove away like I was nothing. Guys, before I tell you what Judge Caprio does next, I need you to do something. In the comments below, tell me where you're watching this from and whether you believe that wealth should ever protect someone from accountability. Because this story is about more than one accident. It's about whether we still believe in equal justice under the law. Judge Caprio stood up from the bench, something he only does when a case has affected him deeply. He stepped down and walked slowly around the courtroom, his hands clasped behind his back. The entire room watched in absolute silence. Mr. Worthington, he began, his voice heavy with disappointment. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen very carefully. I've been sitting on this bench for 31 years. In that time, I've seen thousands of young people make mistakes. Real mistakes. Teenagers who shoplifted because their families couldn't afford food. Young adults who drove without licenses because they needed to get to work. People who made genuine errors in judgment and showed remorse. He stopped walking and faced Brandon directly. But what you did wasn't a mistake. Hitting Mr. Chen, that could have been an accident. Maybe you were distracted, maybe you were speeding, maybe the sun was in your eyes. Those things happen. But what happened next? That was a choice. You chose to keep driving. You chose not to call for help. You chose to go out to dinner with your friends. You chose to mock your victim on social media. Those were all choices. Brandon's smug expression was beginning to crack. One of his attorneys whispered something to him, but Judge Caprio continued. Your attorney says you have no criminal record, that you're from a good family. Let me tell you something about good families, Mr. Worthington. Good families teach their children accountability. Good families teach empathy. Good families teach that with privilege comes responsibility. Judge Caprio's voice grew stronger. Your father sitting in that gallery, he's built a real estate empire. I'm sure he's worked very hard. But somewhere along the way, you learned that money means you don't have to face consequences. And that ends today. Judge Caprio slowly removed his glasses, the gesture that everyone who knows him recognizes as the signal that something profound is about to happen. Ems Rodriguez, I'd like to hear from the medical professionals who treated Mr. Chen. The prosecutor called Dr. Rebecca Walsh, the emergency room physician who had treated Harold Chen the night of the accident. Dr. Walsh was a veteran ER doctor with 20 years of experience, and her testimony was devastating. When Mr. Chen arrived at the hospital, he was in critical condition. Dr. Walsh explained, her voice professional but tinged with emotion. He had lost significant blood. His blood pressure was dangerously low. 3 of his ribs were broken, one of which had punctured his lung, causing it to partially collapse. His left arm was fractured in 2 places. He had severe internal bleeding in his abdomen that required emergency surgery, and he had sustained a traumatic brain injury with significant swelling. In your medical opinion, Dr. Walsh, what would have happened if Mr. Chen had received help immediately at the scene? Judge Caprio asked. His prognosis would have been significantly better. The delay in treatment, the time he spent lying on that street, that made everything worse. The internal bleeding, the brain swelling, all of it was exacerbated by the delay. If someone had called for help immediately, if someone had applied pressure to his wounds, if someone had simply stayed with him until paramedics arrived, we could have prevented some of the worst complications. And what about his long-term prognosis now? Dr. Walsh's expression grew somber. Mr. Chen will likely never regain full use of his left arm. The nerve damage was extensive. He has permanent cognitive effects from the brain injury, memory issues, difficulty with balance. He'll require ongoing physical therapy for months, possibly years. His quality of life has been permanently diminished. Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time, there was something other than arrogance in his expression. Perhaps it was the clinical, detailed description of the harm he'd caused. Perhaps it was the weight of the courtroom's collective stare. Judge Caprio thanked Dr. Walsh and turned to Sarah Chen. Ms. Chen, you submitted a victim impact statement. Would you like to read it to the court? Sarah Chen stood, her hands shaking as she held a piece of paper. Your Honor, my father is my hero. He raised me by himself after my mother passed away when I was 8. He worked 2 jobs to put me through college. He never complained, never asked for anything. Her voice broke. After the accident, when I got the call from the hospital, they told me to come immediately because they didn't know if he would make it through the night. She looked directly at Brandon, tears streaming down her face. Do you have any idea what it's like to sit in a hospital waiting room, not knowing if your father is going to die, while the person who hit him is out having dinner with friends? Do you have any idea what it's like to watch your father, this strong man who survived war, struggle to remember your name because of brain damage? The courtroom was absolutely silent except for Sarah's quiet sobs. Even Brandon's father had lowered his head. My dad was independent. He lived alone, took care of himself, volunteered at the VA hospital helping other veterans. Now he can't be left alone. I had to quit my job to take care of him full time. Our lives have been completely destroyed, and this boy doesn't even have the decency to apologize. That's when something extraordinary happened. Judge Caprio walked over to the witness stand where Sarah was standing and gently took her hand. Your father is a hero, Miss Chen. To his country, to you, and his courage in this courtroom today shows he still is. I promise you that justice will be served. He turned back to Brandon, and the look in his eyes signaled that everything was about to change. Mr. Worthington, stand up. Brandon stood, his attorneys rising with him. The teenager's hands were shaking now, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. I've heard your attorneys argue that you deserve leniency because of your age, because you have no prior record, because you come from a good family. They've suggested community service, probation, maybe some counseling. They've implied that because your father can afford the best legal representation, you should somehow receive special treatment. Judge Caprio's voice was like steel. But I've also seen the evidence. I've seen the traffic camera footage of you striking Mr. Chen and accelerating away. I've seen your social media posts mocking your victim. I've heard testimony about the permanent harm you've caused. and I've watched you sit in this courtroom with barely a flicker of remorse." Judge Caprio walked back to the bench and sat down, putting his glasses back on. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm finding you guilty on all charges: felony hit and run causing serious bodily injury, reckless endangerment, and leaving the scene of an accident." Brandon's face went white. His father stood up in the gallery, starting to protest, but the bailiff moved toward him and he sat back down. "You are hereby sentenced to 18 months in the juvenile detention facility, with the possibility of transfer to adult prison if you turn 18 before completing your sentence. You will serve every single day of that sentence. No early release, no work release program, no special accommodations because of your family's wealth." One of Brandon's attorneys immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is excessive for a first-time offender. We request—" "Counselor, I'm not finished." Judge Caprio cut him off. "Upon release, Mr. Worthington will be on probation for 5 years. During that time, he will complete 1,000 hours of community service, specifically working with elderly veterans at the VA hospital. He will attend weekly counseling sessions focused on empathy and accountability. His driver's license is suspended for 10 years, and he will personally pay restitution to Mr. Chen for all medical expenses, lost wages, and ongoing care needs." The judge wasn't done. "Furthermore, I'm ordering that Mr. Worthington write a personal letter of apology to Mr. Chen to be delivered within 30 days, and that he create a public statement acknowledging his crime and taking full responsibility to be posted on the same social media platforms where he mocked his victim." Brandon's legs seemed to give out, and he collapsed into his chair. His attorneys were frantically whispering to each other, clearly preparing an appeal. His father's face was red with anger, but Judge Caprio held up his hand for silence one final time. "I want to be very clear about something, Mr. Worthington. This sentence is not about vengeance. It's not about punishing you for being wealthy or privileged. It's about teaching you something that your parents apparently never did: that actions have consequences, that human life has value, and that you are not above the law." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Brandon's. "I've been doing this for over 3 decades, and I've learned that the justice system has 2 purposes. One is to punish wrongdoing, but the other, the more important one, is to rehabilitate, to transform, to help people become better versions of themselves. You are 17 years old. Your brain is still developing. Your character is still forming. You have the opportunity to become someone completely different from the arrogant, callous young man who walked into my courtroom today." Judge Caprio's voice softened slightly. "When you're sitting in that detention facility, when you're working with veterans who sacrificed everything for this country, when you're writing that apology letter, I want you to think about Mr. Chen. Really think about him, not as an obstacle who got in your way, but as a human being with a daughter who loves him, with a lifetime of experiences and sacrifices and dignity. And I want you to ask yourself who you want to be, because you get to choose, Mr. Worthington. Even now, even after everything, you get to choose what kind of person you become." The entire courtroom erupted in applause. Harold Chen was crying, his daughter embracing him. The veterans in the gallery stood and saluted Judge Caprio. Even some of the reporters had tears in their eyes. Brandon sat motionless at the defense table, his face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. The reality of consequences, perhaps for the first time in his privileged life, had finally broken through his wall of arrogance. His attorneys were already discussing appeal options, but even they seemed subdued, recognizing that Judge Caprio's sentence was legally sound and morally unassailable. As the bailiff led Brandon away to begin processing for transfer to juvenile detention, the young man looked back at Harold Chen one final time. This time there was no smirk, no dismissiveness. There was only the beginning of what might possibly be understanding. Judge Caprio called both Harold and Sarah Chen to the bench. Away from the microphones, he spoke to them quietly. "Mr. Chen, you served your country with honor. You deserve to live your remaining years with dignity and peace. I cannot undo what happened to you, but I can ensure that justice is served." Harold shook the judge's hand with his good arm. "Thank you, Your Honor. This isn't about revenge for me. It's about making sure he understands what he did. Maybe this will change him." 6 months later, Harold Chen received a letter. It was handwritten, 12 pages long, and it came from the juvenile detention facility. Brandon Worthington had written it himself, not dictated it to attorneys or crafted it for public relations purposes, but actually sat down and had written it. In that letter, Brandon described his first months in detention, the humbling experience of having no special treatment, no privilege, no escape from accountability. He wrote about the counseling sessions where he was finally forced to confront his own behavior, his own narcissism, his own lack of empathy. He described meeting other young people in detention who came from difficult circumstances, who had made mistakes born from desperation rather than arrogance, and how ashamed he felt comparing their stories to his own. He wrote about reading the news coverage of the case, seeing himself described as a symbol of everything wrong with wealth and privilege, and recognizing that the description was accurate. Most importantly, he apologized. Not a legal apology crafted by attorneys, but a genuine, raw expression of remorse for the pain he had caused. He acknowledged that no words could undo the harm, that Harold would live with the consequences of Brandon's choices for the rest of his life, but that he wanted Harold to know that he understood, finally, what he had done. Harold Chen kept that letter in his desk drawer and occasionally showed it to his daughter. Maybe Judge Caprio was right, he told Sarah. Maybe people can change. By the time Brandon Worthington was released from detention at 19 years old, he had completed hundreds of hours of work at the VA hospital, helping veterans with physical therapy, reading to those with vision problems, listening to their stories. He had met men and women who had sacrificed everything, who had faced real hardship, real pain, real loss. And somewhere in those experiences, the arrogant teenager who had laughed about hitting an elderly man had transformed into someone different. He enrolled in community college, studying social work. He continued his community service beyond what was required. And once a month, with Harold Chen's permission, he visited the elderly veteran to help with household tasks, to drive him to medical appointments, to simply be present as a living reminder of accountability and redemption. Judge Frank Caprio's decision in the Worthington case became a landmark moment in discussions about juvenile justice, wealth privilege, and the purpose of sentencing. Legal scholars debated whether the sentence was too harsh for a first-time offender or exactly what justice demanded. But for those who were in that courtroom, who saw the transformation of a smug teenager into a sobbing, broken young man finally confronting the weight of his actions, there was no debate. This is what real justice looks like. Not vengeance, not leniency, but accountability paired with the possibility of redemption. If this story restored your faith that justice can still prevail regardless of wealth or privilege, do me a favor. Hit that like button if you believe that every person, no matter how rich or powerful, should face consequences for their actions. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of real justice and human transformation. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that accountability matters. And remember the words Judge Caprio spoke that day: "You are not above the law and you get to choose who you become." Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about transformation. It's about ensuring that when someone causes harm, they don't just pay a fine and walk away. They confront what they've done, they make amends, and they become better people. That's the legacy of Judge Frank Caprio. And that's the lesson Brandon Worthington learned the hard way.